Welcome back, Reluctant Preppers. We're always glad to have this returning guest. He's a favorite among our viewers, and we've got a flood of viewers' questions to point his way. Rob Kirby is a proprietary analyst knowledgeable about the precious metals and financial markets. Rob, thanks for joining us here again on Reluctant Preppers.
Pleasure to be with you again, Dunnigan. Happy New Year.
Happy New Year to you as well. Yeah, there's no doubt that people are concerned about financial risks as one of the main concerns that they have, because we've seen a lot of volatility increased in the last couple of quarters in the major stock market indices. We've seen near inversion of the yield curve and so on. But we wanted to go ahead and jump in right away with a new question from a viewer that has to do with a topic we've discussed a couple times in the past that you were mentioning that in our pre-interview talk that you had some new insights into. Victory CSA says, according to Catherine Austin Fitz, the recent changes in the accounting laws under FASB 56 means that all federal agencies and their budgets are no longer subject to any public audit and are no longer subject to any public oversight. In effect, the entire federal budget is now a black budget, meaning the deep state is accountable to no one, and the money in the U.S. Treasury goes out the back door to private corporations. And another person, Michael Gusovsky, says, I just watched the Hunter Fitz interview last night. She made some very strong claims like you've outlined, and it would be great to get a second opinion. So we're coming to you and saying, you've mentioned in the past research done with Catherine Austin Fitz as well as Dr. Mark Skidmore about $21 trillion of missing federal money so far. And if you could update us on latest developments in the sort of unveiling scenario around that, the story, that the cover-up of it or the treatment of it or the claims that are and counterclaims that are being made about it. What do we know recently that we didn't know in the original claims were brought out?
Well, to bring people up to speed a little bit, it was late last year that somebody closer to the mainstream, and I believe it might have been NPR, did some investigation into Skidmore's work. And then they went on to conclude or insinuate that Skidmore didn't believe that this missing 21 trillion was real money. And this is a complete and utter fabrication and a mischaracterization of what Dr. Mark Skidmore believes, and I know this because I speak with him directly, and I speak with Catherine Fitz directly, and they have both stated that these inferences that were drawn, making claims that this missing 21 trillion wasn't real money and might have been what was described as a plug. Well, Mr. Skidmore, or Dr. Skidmore, made no such claim, and doesn't hold that to be a belief of his own. And not to say that Dr. Skidmore knows exactly what the makeup or composition is of this missing 21 trillion, and the reason he cannot come to hard, fast conclusions is because nobody from government is willing to answer very, very basic questions, which one would think that if there wasn't any ill doing, these questions would be very, very easy to answer because they're simple questions. And it's really raised Dr. Skidmore's eyebrow that he can't get answers to extremely simple questions regarding the procedures involved in the assembling of these budgets and of these numbers, that which he really can't make direct. Let's put it this way: the excuses that Skidmore has been given regarding the 21 trillion missing amount to or equate to, and this is where I'm going to take some liberty on my own, to somebody saying my dog ate my homework. Mm-hmm. And this is not an acceptable comeback or answer to these very basic, simple questions that Skidmore's put forward to authorities at the DOD and in the Treasury. as I said to you before we started recording, this is a topic that isn't going to go away. The coverage of this is going to increase, and there's going to be more and more talk about this. And I expect that this year this topic is going to receive an awful lot of attention, because the missing 21 trillion, which I maintain has been siloed in the Exchange Stabilization Fund, an adjunct of the U.S. Treasury that is subject to absolutely no oversight. I believe that this is the key, and the call it the slush fund that officialdom has been utilizing to prop up the U.S. bond market, to prop up U.S. equity markets, and this has what's been used, this dark money that's been contained or siloed in the ESF. This is the money that's been used to basically do covert QE, while the Fed maintains that it stopped doing QE a number of years ago. The reality is that now currently the Fed claims that they've been trimming their balance sheet to the tune of roughly $50 billion worth of securities a month. And in recent months, we've had the likes of China, Russia, say that they're absolutely dumping, and there have been, even in the mainstream, there have been articles that the world has been dumping U.S. government securities. Well, with the Fed a seller, and with America's biggest creditors a seller of U.S. government securities, how is it, Dunnigan, that the 10-year bond has rallied in recent months from a high of maybe 320 or a little higher down to 270 or 269 where it sits today? This flies in the face of what we empirically know, that nobody's buying U.S. government debt. The U.S. is issuing record new amounts of debt, and the bonds are rallying. Like it's grade 6 type of mentality to ask who's buying the bonds. And the only explanation that I can come to in my mind, because it makes sense, is that U.S. government debt is being monetized by the U.S. Treasury itself through the allegiance of the Exchange Stabilization Fund with this money, this dark money, this 21 trillion that's been cooked up, and it's in existence, and the enormity of this fraud, which it most certainly is. It implicates everyone. Like it implicates all the governing structure of the United States, and it also implicates the Federal Reserve, because they necessarily had to have been complicit in creating this money. And it makes a mockery of the monetary aggregate data that is published by the St. Louis Federal Reserve. It makes them look like a pile of absolute lying fools that they would publish monetary aggregate data that doesn't include an extra 21 trillion that they've cooked up and created on the side, thinking that we all were just a little bit too stupid to ever figure out what they were doing. Like it's an insult to the intelligence of everybody in the world. You see, and this also, Dunnigan, is what's at the root of all this geopolitical distrust, putting it politely or lightly. Why China? Why tensions are at a fevered pitch between America and virtually everybody? Because you see, the way things are working in the world today is that America prints money for a living, and the rest of the world has to work for a living. And they work, as in the rest of the world works, and America prints money and effectively steals the bounty of the rest of the world's labor. And when I say this, I'm not directing anger or heat towards rank and file Americans.
It's not about the American people.
It's not about the American people. It's this. We're talking about a corrupt gang of globalist dirtbags who have seized control of America and are using America like a dirty rag doll, and using the American military to engage in military adventurism all over the world, to recreate the world in some crazy fascistic image that they've concocted on their own. And there's no doubt in my mind that this globalist entity is in bed with the Democratic Party and a lot of the mainstream Republican Party in America. And these people have absolutely pulled a number that is, it's colossal fraud against humanity. And the reason why the establishment is so absolutely hair on fire upset with Trump, in my view anyway, is that Trump wants no part of this. And Trump doesn't come from the same side of the tracks as these globalist dirtbags who have commandeered the leadership apparatus in America. Trump is anti this. And this is the true nature of why they are doing everything in their power to denigrate him and to smear him and to try and remove him from power. So this 21 trillion, like I say, this is a big thing, and I think it's going to become a much bigger thing this year. And the U.S. government canceling accounting for all government is not going to stop this issue from being raised and being given ample treatment, at least in the alternative press.
Yeah, and the fact you mentioned your prediction that it will be getting closer coverage, that there will be unavoidable, it'll be forced in, that the mainstream press, or so-called the corporate press, will be forced into eventually having to cover this year. There's three things you touched on in there that echoed input that we've gotten elsewhere. Gregory Mannarino talked about when you talk about exchange stabilization fund intervening in markets, not only you mentioned the bond market, he mentioned in the equities market, the stock market, that despite any amount of bad corporate earnings reports, store closings, and faltering low profit warnings from Apple, we've had even J.P. Morgan failing to deliver on 10% or more below expected earnings now, and yet stocks continue to drive higher. And he talked about just as this is Obama era stock market. It also reminded me, talked about ESF directly intervening in the bond market, that despite even the downgrade yesterday, January 10th, we had from London Reuters, Fitch reiterating its warning on Wednesday that the United States could lose its prized AAA credit rating if the country's debt ceiling is not raised in coming months. So you've got threatened downgrades of the U.S. Debt rating, and yet, as you mentioned, so much mystery buyers of the bonds that it drives the short-term interest rates down. And then you mentioned militarism globally at the Ron Paul Peace and Prosperity Conference in Washington, D.C. He had several speakers, including retired military and others, talking about the absolute unjustifiable nature of the over spending and over involvement of the U.S. military, misuse of the U.S. military in adventures outside our right and proper sphere of influence and to protect our borders, that sort of thing. And we've also had Dr. Vieira on talking about the role of the citizen soldier, the militias from the Constitution being completely co-opted, and now we have not only the National Guard but also the armed forces being co-opted by the government for escapades that have nothing to do with protecting our home turf and that sort of thing. So, voice after voice after voice on our channel has corroborated exactly what you're describing about misuse of our country, misuse of our finances, misuse of our military.
Yeah, and a couple of points I think that's very worthy of mention here. When I speak in terms of how this issue is not going away, this is another manifestation of the rise of populism, Dunnigan. And populism is rising everywhere in the world. We're seeing it with Prime Minister May basically being told, she's basically being shown the door. Mm-hmm. And Britons are not going to accept her sellout of a Brexit deal, which she's tried to foist on the people. Populism is also rising in France with the Yellow Vest movement, and Yellow Vest movement is also now spreading to other countries on the continent of Europe, and we also see populism is rearing its head in Italy, and we're seeing populism raise its head with the election of Bolsonaro in Brazil, and this is something that's not going to go away. And another thing that you mentioned just a little bit earlier with regards to J.P. Morgan, who announced a miss on their quarterly results, I believe it was just this morning. They attributed the miss to getting it wrong in the fixed income. They attributed the miss to their fixed income desk. And let me explain to you the importance or the significance of J.P. Morgan missing it because of fixed income activity. J.P. Morgan has a derivatives book somewhere in the neighborhood of 50 trillion in notional, and 80% or thereabouts of that 50 trillion in derivatives are interest rate contracts, and with a very significant portion of that being interest rate swaps. And interest rate swaps have embedded in them bond trades. And of course these institutions claim that their interest rate swaps are all hedged. But let me explain something to everybody. The hedges, when you have a book of maybe 40 trillion in interest rate contracts, derivative contracts on your books or off your books, and you claim it's all hedged, the hedges are dynamic, and the hedges themselves change value in very fast markets in fixed income. Those hedges can change value very, very quickly. And if they've got it wrong on the fixed income side, the likelihood that there could be some sort of a whoops on their interest rate derivative book rises dramatically. And you see, if an institution like J.P. Morgan gets it wrong, maybe to the tune of 2% on a $40 trillion book, 2% of 40 trillion is more money than JP Morgan has capital. So we could see some very unexpected lightning bolts out of a blue sky type of events in the major banks in America with their derivatives books, because if J.P. Morgan got it wrong in fixed income, I'd be willing to bet you a roll of quarters that Bank of America, Citibank, Goldman, and Morgan Stanley very likely got it wrong also. And these things are set up like daisy chains, and if one link breaks in the chain, the chain stops looking like a chain, and instead it takes on characteristics of dominoes. And when they start falling, they can fall very fast and very extensively. So that's something that people might want to keep an eye out for as we move forward here over the next number of weeks and months.
Well, thank you for that update on the 21 trillion and why it's important, and why we might be seeing why you have increased confidence and corroboration that it's actually showing up in these places where there seems to be no other explanation but this huge invisible hand holding up the equities and holding down the bond rates.
Yeah. The other thing, Dunnigan, Skidmore and Catherine Fitz are not going to let go of this very easily.
Good.
And to me, based on my communications with them, it's like they have they're treating it much like the way a dog treats a bone. They've got a good grip on it, and they're not going to let go. So there's going to be more and more and more discussion and revelation, and it's going to be very topical. So anyway, be interesting to see.
Yeah, we're looking forward to any revelations of the truth that can help to dispel some of the bizarre upside downness to a lot of what we're being told or not told. We've got another question. I don't think I can pronounce this person's name because it's a bunch of consonants all in a row. Asking, I thought for a while of moving to Canada. I no longer feel Canada or anywhere else like South America will be any different from the U.S. Any perspectives from someone who's wanting to find a jurisdiction that reduces their risk of financial or loss of liberty about comparing the U.S. versus Canada or any other jurisdiction?
Well, I mean, I live in Canada, and to me, Canada is Canada with its current leadership, which I am not a big supporter of. Canada resembles a rudderless ship to me, but an awful lot of countries in the world resemble rudderless ships to me right now. And I mean, I've lived my whole life in Canada. I'm sort of I'm a little bit on the fence in terms of thinking about another jurisdiction to go and set up shop. My feeling is, would I want to necessarily jump out of the pot to jump into the fire? I'm comfortable, or I'm comfortable from the standpoint that Canadians are my countrymen. The customs in Canada are quite humanity friendly. Mm-hmm. And have been for a very, very, very long time. And a lot of jurisdictions that might be alternatives don't necessarily have the history of peace and let's say non-warring. Mm-hmm. And for that reason, I'm going to stay put where I am. And I'd rather stick it out with the buggers I know than buggers I know nothing about. So I guess that's really what it comes down to. But I wouldn't take my comment as a vote of confidence.
Gotcha.
In this country at all, because we are a boat drifting. Rudderless.
Yeah, just today today, folks, is Tuesday, January 15th, 2019. Gregory Manarino in his TradersChoice.net post-market wrap-up talked about what is the difference, he asked, what is the difference between President Trump's current policies and the way that he's working with his central bank, the Fed, versus the policies of other world leaders and the way that they're working with their central banks. And he put a big zero up there to say that we're seeing such a lockstep unanimity among most countries and their central banks of easy money policies and buying down interest rates, et cetera, propping up equity markets.
Well, I mean, listen, there is a difference between Trump and other leaders. I mean, I look at, in Canada, I look at our Prime Minister, Trudeau. To me, Trudeau is a globalist, absolutely, and Trump is not a globalist. And but that does not mean that I'm going to pack up my bags and try to move to America anytime soon, because I think America has bigger issues that it's facing. I think Trump has issues that he's facing that are going to be extremely difficult to deal with, because I think Trump is very aware of the. I think Trump is aware of the 21 trillion that's missing, and what's happened, because he would have to know. I mean, I don't envy Trump for the position he's in. I think I've said it on with you in the past. To me, Trump has been thrown into the wheelhouse of the Titanic after they stopped for ice, and I don't think anybody being in that position. When I look at the leader of Canada, Trudeau, I mean, he's just a willful idiot who is he's either doing what he's told, or he's playing a game where he's being aggrandized by a bunch of people that would do him in quicker than you could say, it's a fraud. But this is what happens when you elect as your prime minister a drama teacher from middle school. Sad story, but that's what we got. So we got a bad hand of cards, and we got to play them here. So America, on the other hand, has a leader who is anti-globalist, and that to me is, that to me tells me that America maybe has a shred of hope.
It is worth something to think that you've got at least somebody along the chain who's willing to fight to try to keep some kind of liberty or autonomy at the level that it can, closer to you, and not just hand over the keys to global interests. Jeffrey Messina asks, is junk silver safer than eagles? And do you believe there will be confiscation? So two different questions. Is junk silver safer than eagles?
In terms of safety, or in terms of
maybe recognition by people after some kind of a disturbance or an upset or a collapse, do you think there'll be any?
No, I don't. I mean, I think junk silver, and when we talk about junk silver, we're talking about currency that was formerly in circulation prior to 1967 in Canada, and maybe 66, I believe.
64 and below, so before 65 in the U.S. Yeah.
You're talking about old minted silver currency, nickels, dimes, quarters, and half dollars and dollars. To me, it's all silver bullion, and I think silver bullion is one of the most undervalued assets on the planet. So, whether you hold your silver bullion in the form of junk silver or silver eagles or silver maples, to me isn't such a big deal, because I think they're both very good. And dealing with confiscation, am I worried about it? In Canada, I think the chances of it are zero. In America, America has confiscated metal before, but at the end of the day, if they tried to confiscate it, I think that the effect of trying to confiscate silver at this point in America would be maybe as reckless as trying to confiscate guns. Mm-hmm. And I just don't think people are going to give up their silver or their guns very easily.
I remember a quote from Obama partway through his administration, commenting to some group, and I don't know who he was speaking to, and he said it looks like he's done well for the firearms industry, because since he got into the presidency, the sales went nowhere but up. Yeah.
I mean, if anybody asks me to turn in my silver, I mean, I just don't have any.
Yeah.
So there you go.
Munhum3 says, what is going on with the EFPs, exchange for physical? Why is the COMEX allowed to transfer 2.8 billion ounces of silver buying pressure over to the London Bullion Exchange last year? The annual world mine supply is about 800 million. How can they allow 3.5 times the annual silver production to be transferred like this? Whose economic interest does this serve?
Yeah, well, the COMEX is a lot of people view the COMEX as some sort of symbol of freedom. And COMEX is anything but a symbol of freedom. And COMEX is really like a very exclusive private country club. And they make their own rules. And if you're doing something that they don't like, or if they just don't like the way you look, or if they don't like the way you talk and walk, they'll throw you out of their club. So, and if you don't believe me, ask the Hunts, because the Hunt brothers tried to corner the silver market back in 1980. And what the COMEX did was change all their rules. And they changed the rules and inflicted rules on the Hunts that they could no longer buy COMEX silver. They could only liquidate. So that made the Hunts sellers because they could no longer buy. And so their game was up. And what people fail to recognize, at least I believe, is that they're a private club. And if you go, well, how did they get away with it? The same way that Facebook and Twitter and Google can censor and evict conservative commentary off of their platforms by claiming that, they're a private company and they basically can do whatever they want. And I mean, it's absolutely censorship what they've been doing, and they get away with that because that's just the way it is. And it'll be that way until it isn't that way, and what it will take to change the censorship in the social media circles. It'll take action on the part of the Department of Justice and likely antitrust or RICO statutes being invoked, and maybe breaking up some of these big social media companies. But and likewise with the COMEX, supposedly a bastion of free market price discovery, which is completely and utterly laughable. Because I mean, everything about COMEX, it's a working crime scene every day, with the amount of gold and silver that gets transacted. Fractional, the amount of gold and silver contracts that get traded on the COMEX make a mockery of the mining industry and how much gold is actually extracted from the Earth's crust every year, and how much silver is extracted from the Earth's crust every year, because the prices are being set arbitrarily. And if history is any guide, we know that when prices of anything are set arbitrarily, effectively through central planning, which is what the old Soviet Union used to do with the price of everything, these systems ultimately fail, because everywhere they've ever been practiced, they have failed. And the only unknown is how long does it take before it fails. And, COMEX has ultimately, and the LBMA, have ended up being an expression or a manifestation of central planning. And these central planning models are destined for failure. And, my attitude is the fact that they haven't failed yet only gives people that have the means to acquire more. It's like topping up your insurance. And if you're afforded that ability, and if you have the means to do it, I think you're foolish if you're not doing it.
Fair enough. Tyree Lush says, hi, Rob. Jim Willey recently talked about the possibility of central banks starting to hoard gold in order to cover their toxic debts, and under the rule of the BIS, will, at some point, revalue the gold price considerably higher to cover their exposure. Do you agree with Jim, and are central banks moving in this direction of accumulating gold?
Sure, Asian countries are doing this now. Um, so it's not yet fashionable in the West for uh, central banks to be doing this, or at least to admit that they're doing this. Whether they're doing it undercover is another thing. But yeah, there's going to be more and more and more of that occurring as time goes along, because fiat money is going to fail, plain and simple. And the notion that America can create $21 trillion of extra American money and not have the value of the American dollar go to Zool is that is just something that won't happen. And as the world becomes more and more aware of the significance of America cooking up an extra 21 trillion of off-book dollars, the dollar will lose its preeminence as the world's reserve currency, plain and simple, because it's like look, the world is playing at a poker table where America owns the house. And when the world finally figures it out, and it's irrefutable that America's playing with marked cards, because that's what it amounts to. The rest of the world, and many of them have already done so, but the rest of the world's going to walk away, because who wants to play at a table where the cards are marked, and you're a patsy and a dupe for sitting at the table throwing your chips in the middle? And that's what's going on in the world. Okay? And you can't sanction countries and make countries sit down and play cards at a table where the dealer's using a marked deck. They'll tell you to go to hell. Mm-hmm. And that's what's happening. It's happening in spades all over the world right now.
This next question is one that you've talked about, I think, long ago with us in the past. Ascanius says, what options do we have to protect our stock-based investments? Example, here in Canada, people have broker accounts through banks. If we have a portfolio with a Bank of Montreal or Scotiabank, etc., where can we transfer our stock holdings so we hold the certificates?
I don't own any stocks, so I guess you can infer whatever you want from that statement. I don't believe. I'm not a believer in paper anything. I'm not a believer in. And that being said, it's not to say I don't believe in equity, or having equity in a business, or having equity in a concern. It's just that it gets back to. It's sort of like using my analogy of playing cards with a dealer, and you catch him with marked cards, and it's like, if he says, "Well, okay, I have another deck here. Well, we can play with these cards." I don't want to play with. It's not the cards. I don't want to play with that dealer. I don't want to play in that establishment, because I don't no longer trust the integrity of the house. And if you're invested heavily in equities, you're playing with that house. I'm just not a big believer. And I'm not saying that there will be equities and stocks that will go up, and some will go down. But when people find out that the foundation that everything's built on is really sand, wet sand, or quicksand, how is the integrity of the value of your investment going to be maintained when it's all built on quicksand? Anyway, that's why I'm into, and I've long been an advocate of holding physical precious metal. Mm-hmm. And if you hold it yourself, you got it. And if you own shares in XYZ, if there's a financial collapse, if legislation exists or is quickly passed where financial institutions can effectively take control of your assets and liquidate them to shore up, their financial situation. I just not a believer in having the beneficial ownership of anything held by a third party. Mm-hmm. With what I see coming. That's my view.
This one is related tangentially, not much more than tangentially, to the Exchange Stabilization Fund question. This is Inside Nyanda Speaks, who asks, hello, Mr. Kirby. Thank you for your time and expertise. My question is, it's been theorized that $3 trillion of Saudi assets are being held captive as part of the Exchange Stabilization Fund. If this is true and the Saudi-American divorce is at this point on full display, what factors could be stopping the Saudis from dumping its other U.S.-based assets and ending the U.S. petrodollar stronghold, and what consequences?
It's a great question. I would answer that question with another question. How sure are we that Saudi Arabia is not selling crude oil right now for Chinese currency or for Russian currency? The reality is, if they were doing it, they would never admit it publicly. And if they were doing it, I think they'd be actually helping themselves and doing something financially intelligent. Mm-hmm. So, and the Saudis are also known, have long been known to be huge holders of physical metal. So, I guess more or less answers your question.
Fair enough. New World Forward says most of the Western world has, since the last crisis, implemented a legal framework for bail-in procedures in case of bank failures. Do you think this was done in preparation for the next crisis? If so, how do you see a bail-in scenario play out, and how would we, savers and workers, be affected by it?
Well, the working model for bail-ins is Cyprus, where it was implemented. And it's, how could I envision it being implemented? I could see it being implemented where anybody with an account balance over maybe $25,000 or $50,000 is effectively taxed, maybe 10% of the value. So if you're holding a lot of cash in a bank, if you're holding $1 million, you take a 10% haircut, maybe, and that would be like the ante in the game, because I'm sure there'd be more once the confiscations start. They usually run for a while, so maybe they start off, they take 10% of your net worth that you have visible in a bank account, and if that isn't enough or doesn't raise enough, then they just up the ante. Can I see that happening? Yeah. Do I think that the reason why different countries have put this type of legislation in their budgets? Yeah, they're preparing for. It's government's job to prepare for continuity of effectively the regime that has them in power. And, continuity of government actions typically involve ensuring that the financial system remains solvent. And if making the financial system solvent means that it makes you as an individual insolvent, they don't really care.
Yeah.
Continuity of government isn't about individual rights.
This one's related. Richard Ralph Rail says, will the collapse of the dollar's global reserve status and or hyperinflation of the dollar's worth cause credit mechanisms needed for everyday business to seize up? You were just talking about business continuity and the ability to keep the regime in power. So this is kind of looking at it from the other way and saying, won't hyperinflation and the loss of the global reserve status cause the credit mechanisms needed for everyday business to seize up?
Well, my answer to that would be take a look at what's going on in Venezuela right now, because they're going through a hyperinflation right now. And you see, a lot of people I think erroneously make the mistake of thinking that hyperinflation means that all business stops. Commerce will continue. They will jerry-rig a system whereby commerce can continue, or at least essential commerce can continue. But will there be opportunities, and will there will be fortunes made, and there will be fortunes lost, and people who have maintained a degree of nimbleness, or people who haven't. Listen, when catastrophes happen, people that make out the best in a catastrophe situation are people with insurance. Okay, when a hurricane comes through a coastal community and wipes out all the buildings and all the homes, the people that are better off, relatively speaking, are people that had insurance. And in California, when the wildfires come through and burn cities and towns down, people who are relatively better off are people who had fire insurance. And sure as shooting, when there's a financial calamity, people that will be relatively better off will be people who had financial insurance. And what financial insurance is gold and silver. And it's always been that way, and it very likely will always be that way. So if you don't have some, you better get some. And if you have some already, you might want to ask yourself if you have enough.
This one circles back to a question you were talking about in the beginning about the derivatives complex. Opening Ice asks, how does the derivatives complex affect the money supply? How has Deutsche Bank and several other big banks managed to lower their derivative holdings? In Deutsche Bank's case, I believe it's from $72 trillion in 2013 to $55 trillion in 2017. Did the contracts expire, or are we talking about some kind of stealth bailout where the derivatives are bought and parked in some publicly owned account? So there's really two big questions there. One is, how does the derivatives complex affect the money supply? And secondly, how are they able to unwind that?
Yeah, well, first, to the best of my knowledge, Deutsche Bank's derivatives book is much smaller than 55 trillion that you just mentioned.
Okay.
The last annual report that I saw on Deutsche Bank was 2 years ago, and it was down to 42 trillion. And I do believe it's continued to drop from there. And the reason it's dropping is because the German financial regulator, BaFin, has ordered Deutsche Bank out of those markets. Just as they ordered Deutsche Bank to get out of the gold market, which they did after admitting that they were involved in rigging the price of both gold and silver. And then they closed their book. They exited I believe it was the London Silver Fix they were engaged in, no longer. And I believe they've closed their gold desk completely. And sorry, and the other part of that question was?
How does the derivatives complex affect the money supply?
Well, how does it affect the money supply? Well, derivatives do have, they all have a maturity. Okay, so when a bank has a $50 trillion notional derivatives book, they might have 55 or 60% of that book might mature in 2 years or less. And then they'd have another amount of the book that would mature in 2 to 5 years, and then another portion of the book might mature in 5 to 10 years. So it's broken down in terms of the longest stuff most banks would have on their books, derivative-wise, would be 10 years. The shortest stuff they'd have on their books could be literally a number of days or weeks, and everything in between. So, the answer is unless maturing contracts are replaced, the book contracts. And if maturing contracts are just replaced, the book remains static. And if there's a big add to the book, you know that the bank has been engaged in not only enough to make up for the expiring contracts, but they've added a lot more, which means they've been a lot more aggressive in a certain area.
We have one, this brings it down to the individual again. Eric Fox says, is there anything we can do individually, collectively, to bring this madness to a head? We are being eaten alive, death by 1,000 paper cuts.
You know, the biggest thing that individuals can do, in my view, to bring a quicker ending to this than otherwise would be, is to buy physical ounces of metal. And specifically, I'd say buy physical silver, because I think silver is absolutely an Achilles heel. The withdrawal of physical metal from the marketplace makes the paper game much more difficult to play for the guys doing the rigging.
I think that we're just about out of time. Rob, as always, we'd like to give you the last chance. You've been fielding with quite a lot of generosity, a lot of our viewers' questions. But as far as what you're watching most closely, it sounds like you're in close contact with some frequency with both Catherine Austin Fitts and Dr. Mark Skidmore. So one of the things it sounds like you're really watching closely is the unfolding saga of the revelations around the missing $21 trillion and where it's being used. Anything else that you want to leave with our viewers about things that they should be paying attention to that they're not hearing about on the corporate media?
Well, I guess more than anything, try to deprogram yourself, or try not to watch mainstream news. CNN is poison. CNBC is poison. The New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, they're all poison. And, the alternative press is the real press now. And this is what has the globalist entity very, very concerned and very worried. And we have proof of that, because it's the alternative voices that they're trying to silence through censorship and smears. So, stay attuned with what's going on, and seek out alternative, differing alternative voices in the alternative press, because that's where you're going to get real goods.
Rob, thank you so much for joining us again, and always sharing your insights with us and your perspectives with us here on Reluctant Preppers.
Pleasure being with you again.
And folks, if you want to help support this independent voice, remember that we are vulnerable to being demonetized or kicked off of YouTube, for example. So any support you can give us at patreon.com/reluctantpreppers will be of great help. So look to you next time. Rob, thanks for joining us.
My pleasure.
They say the stock market crashed today.
Yeah, I heard that.
Sounds like people's retirement accounts and savings accounts are going to get bailed into the banks.
Yeah.
Looks like pension plans and Social Security are going to get suspended too.
I know.
Sure, I'm glad we decided to put our money into gold and silver instead.
Me too.
Get your first ounce of silver at spot price and free shipping on any order over $99 at sdbullion.com/RP. Hey, Reluctant Preppers. If you haven't heard, we've already started our monthly 1-ounce U.S. Silver Eagle thank you gift to one active Patreon subscriber each month, signed by your host, Dunnigan Kaiser. And you don't want to miss out on that.
Please help us grow by subscribing today at patreon.com/reluctantpreppers.